Hi, I'm Myiah Hutchens. I'm an associate professor and associate chair of the public relations department here at the University of Florida. What I specialize in is political communication. In particular, I look at how people approach and process information that we disagree with and how that can be useful in a political system. So one of the things that really influences that is being aware of biases that we have when it comes to processing information. This is something that we all do, but it's something that is helpful to be aware of what it is that we do. So today what I'd like to do is talk you through a few of the really common cognitive biases that we have that influences how we process that information. And then what are some practical things that you can implement in order to have more effective conversations with people that you disagree with. So let's talk about these biases, right? So one bias that is really important when it comes to understanding how we process information is cognitive dissonance. So what cognitive dissonance is this idea that we are uncomfortable with being internally inconsistent. So we tend to think of ourselves as good people. We like to think one of the things that helps us be good people is that we're very consistent, right? No one likes a hypocrite. And so cognitive dissonance is that tendency that we have to make sure that we're looking at information to protect this sense of dissonance, right? That we don't want to have dissonance. We want to make sure that we're removing all of the dissonance that we can in our lives, right? To use a real practical example, I'm going to talk you through cognitive dissonance that I have to resolve with myself all of the time. So two things that are very much true about myself is I'm a foodie. I am a super annoyingly geeky foodie that really loves all things food. I got on the sourdough craze before everyone else did. This is something that is sort of key to who I am. I also think Cheetos are the most delicious snack that's ever been created, and it is the perfect food, right? The problem is this creates cognitive dissonance, right? The idea of being a foodie is inconsistent with this idea of loving this super highly processed snack food. And so by having those two things in my brain, I have this uncomfortable reaction, right? That this isn't something that we like. So one of the ways that I can overcome this cognitive dissonance is I can try to balance it out with other cognitions, other pieces of information that can be held in my brain, right? So one of these things could be this idea that biology is really hard to override, right? There's been research into Cheetos that suggests that Cheetos were scientifically engineered to be the perfect food, that it's the perfect combination of crunch and salt and fat that just makes it really difficult for us as humans to resist, right? I'm also someone who sees myself as a scientist, so I can be like, oh, right, well, I also am a scientist, and this was created via science, and biology is hard to override, and so I'm going to feel a little bit less bad about this dissonance. I can then further add, well, Cheetos are cheese, and cheese is a foodie thing, and so yes, I am now happy with this. My cognitive dissonance has been resolved by trying to balance out these cognitions in my brain. And so this process is something that we go through all of the time, that we're constantly trying to interpret information in a way that makes us feel better about ourselves, in a way that makes us feel more internally consistent, and in a way that supports sort of our view of ourselves as good, right? So cognitive dissonance is something that we try to avoid a lot in our lives. And so how we do this is through a couple of other biases that tend to happen and tend to influence how we approach information. A really popular and common one of these is confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is the idea that I can give you information and you are going to interpret that information in a way that's going to be consistent with what you already believe, right? Favorite example of this is flat earthers, right? So I can give flat earthers information trying to convince them that the world is round, but they're going to take that information and interpret it in a way that reinforces that preconception that they have of the world being flat. Right? A real life instance of this was there were individuals who tried to take the president of the Flat Earth Society and put him on a boat, and the boat sailed around the globe. And they thought that this was a way that was going to prove to the president of the Flat Earth Society that indeed the world is a globe rather than a flat disk. However, how the president of the Flat Earth Society interpreted that information was to say that instead of going around a globe, they were simply skating around the edge of the sphere of the flat disk, right? And so something like this, it's hard for us to counteract, right? That people are just going to take this information and interpret in a way that matches what they already believe, right? And we do this to help reduce our cognitive dissonance, right? If I don't have information that is challenging what I already think, then it's not something that I have to resolve. Another way that this shows up is through something called motivated reasoning. So what motivated reasoning is that it's a defensive processing that is going to help us believe what we want to believe, right? So what happens is we're going to scrutinize information that's inconsistent with what we already think in a way much more hardly than information that is consistent with what we already think, right? So when something good happens to me, I'm going to think it's because I'm skilled, right? That it is information that I'm not going to judge hardly or harshly, right? I'm just going to interpret that information as being a good thing for me because, of course, I am so skilled. When something good happens to someone I don't like, I'm going to interpret that as that individual had a whole bunch of luck, right? They aren't good, they aren't skilled, they just must have gotten lucky to have this thing happen to them. Right? And so these combinations of confirmation bias, right? So seeking out, these automatic tendencies to make data fit with what we already believe. And then we're going to have motivated reasoning, which is going to make us scrutinize information in a way to again, make us feel better about ourselves. These are things that we do all the time, and it tends to influence how we process information with people who are different from ourselves, or information that we disagree with. Another really common thing that we have to watch out for when we're looking at conversations or seeking out information that's inconsistent with what we already believe is the idea that social identity is really, really prevalent, and it is going to shape how we process information. We treat people in our in-groups, so people who we see as similar to ourselves, part of our same social network, that we see them as better, and we are going to give them positive reasons for their actions or interpret what they're doing in a much more generous way than we do of individuals who are in our outgroup, right? People who are not in our outgroup. A really sort of common thing or a common example of this is imagine you're standing in a line and then someone bumps you in that line, right? You fall forward, you spill something, you're upset. You turn and look around to see who it is that bumped you. If it's someone that you would perceive as a member of your in-group, right? So I'm a University of Florida professor. If I turn around and I see the person is also wearing University of Florida gear, I now put them in my in-group, right? And so I interpret them bumping me as an accident, right? It wasn't done with ill intent. Someone else bumped them, or they tripped, right? It wasn't done maliciously. However, if I turn around and I see that it's someone in my outgroup, right? So Florida State's a big rival of University of Florida. I turn around and I see it's someone from Florida State. Then I'm going to interpret them bumping me as malicious, right? They either did it on purpose, or they're drunk, or some other sort of bad behavior, and that is why they bumped me. And so this is something that we do all of the time, just labeling information the exact same information, but if I label that information as coming from my in-group, I interpreted it favorably. But if that information comes from someone in my out-group, I interpret that information unfavorably. And I think it's problematic. And so all of these biases together can have some real consequences on how we approach conversations and how we tend to engage with information in our everyday lives. So what can we do in order to have more effective conversations, knowing that we tend to have these biases, these biases that influence how we process, right? First and foremost is challenge yourself to seek a variety of perspectives. The more we're exposed to ideas that are different from ourselves, the more we can challenge these biases and be aware that the world is a complex place, and be aware that people who have ideas that are different from my own have valid reasons for doing so, have valid reasons for supporting policies that I otherwise wouldn't support. And that is going to help, just being aware and then practice that muscle of interpreting information that's different from what you think, and that can be helpful. When it comes to you see someone communicating inappropriately, right? And so this is something we see a lot with online conversations, or in politics a lot, right? If you see someone who you would identify as someone of your social network, that would be somebody in your in-group, and you see them behaving inappropriately, call them out, right? Ask them to stop, tell them that that's inappropriate. We don't respond well to members of our out-group trying to correct our behavior. That doesn't work. It doesn't influence our reactions. It doesn't influence our behavior. However, we can be convinced to behave better, right? And to follow better conversational norms when members of our in-group are asking us to modify our behaviors and to change sort of the norms around those discussions. So if you see bad behavior of your in-group, call it out. Tell them that's not important or not appropriate, and try to change those norms. It's also really important to remember, while we have these social identities, we have multiple social identities, right? So I identify as a foodie, I identify as a professor, I identify as a University of Florida Gator, right? There's all of these different things about me that make up who I am, right? And so when you're talking with someone that you disagree with, try to focus on and think about the things that you share and have in common. We have so much more in common with each other than we do things that are different about us. And so the more that we can think about those shared identities, focus on those shared identities, and reinforce them when we're having conversations, that's going to be more useful for us, and that's going to be more productive. It's also really important when you're having these conversations to make sure you're listening, right? If you're in a heated argument, a lot of times what happens is we are waiting our turn to speak rather than listening to what the other person says, right? All of us can probably think and pause and recognize that in ourselves. And so think about that, right? Make sure that you're actually listening, make sure you're actually respecting your discussion partner. The extent that you can reinforce that you are actually listening to what they're saying, they're processing what you're saying, pointing out places where you agree is going to make that conversation much more productive, and you might be able to reach some sort of compromise on areas where you disagree, or at least leave the conversation not feeling negative about it. Most importantly, I think we need to remember that we're talking to people, right? If you're having a disagreement, that you aren't talking to some media caricature of the other side, right? No one is angels, no one is devils. We all exist somewhere in that gray space in between. And so remember, when you're talking to people, you are talking to a person that is multifaceted and has multiple identities. And hopefully that can be something that can help you think about and be aware of those biases that we have when we're engaging in disagreements, and have more productive conversations in the future. So thank you very much. I hope you learned something from this talk, and please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Thank you.